Well, it's Monday again, and this is another one of my "What Do You Know" videos, and I just cover some basics in the videos like this, and I like for everybody to have the kind of an idea that you're going to learn something every time I've ever even gone to a basic class. And I think I may have mentioned this before. There were times when the dealership that I worked for bought franchises for other manufacturers, and because I was their main electrical guy for a lot of the stuff that electrical that needed to be fixed under warranty and stuff like that, I would be required to go to these electrical schools. And every school I went to, even though I'd been to electrical schools with Volkswagen and Mazda and Ford and Chrysler and all these, I would always learn something new, even in a basic electrical class. If you have the idea that there's nothing anybody can teach you, then it handicaps and it hamstrings your ability to learn anything. And so whenever you're going into some sort of a school situation, you don't need to go in there with the idea that I already know all this stuff, and so nobody's going to be able to teach me anything new. Because invariably, sometimes you're going to pick up on something that you had missed at some point before, even though there was a lot of stuff that you thought that you already knew and that nobody could teach you anything new. So anyway, I run through these, what do you know, these basic things every now and then, and I kind of like to cover this stuff periodically just because. This particular thing is talking about basic engine stuff. Every engine has got a foundation. There's a platform that starts from the ground up. If you've got an internal combustion. I know electric vehicles are supposed to be the wave of the future and all that. We'll let the jury may be still out on that. There's a friend of mine that's one of my favorite. I don't know the guy face to face, but he's one of my favorite YouTube subscribers. And he made the remark on a post that I had made on one of the social media platforms that if they did this electric vehicle stuff right, then stations would have racks of fully charged batteries. All the batteries for all electric vehicles would be standardized. And whenever you pulled up there at a station, the battery packs on these vehicles should be fixed so that they could be swapped in just a very few minutes, very simply. And for a fee, you could pull up there, you could have your standardized battery pack swapped out, and then you could take off and finish your trip, and it would be about like gasoline. Like the propane bottles, they've got those out there. You take your old propane bottle, you leave it, and you get another propane bottle, you pay them 17 bucks and all that. Well, if you had, let's say, battery pack modules that you could plug in there, and they were all in a rack out there, where they were obviously locked up so somebody could come out there, an attendant could come out and change them for you for a fee, then you could basically have a whole lot better success with this if you had a bunch of fully charged packs waiting to just plug into your car and go instead of having to plug the doggone thing in. I hear all this stuff about, oh, we've come up with a way to charge batteries in 5 minutes with this special cable and all that. I don't even know how that's physically possible. But what this friend of mine was saying is possible, and I thought that was one of the best ideas that I've heard. If they forced the auto industry to standardize all the battery packs so they'd all be the same. And that may irritate the Tesla people because the whole floor pan of a Tesla is the battery, and that kind of thing. No, one way or another, the bearings, the valve train, the rings, and the cylinder walls have got to be healthy, and they will be what's running right. The cam and the crank have got to be spinning in time, and the spark has got to be strong, and the spark plugs have got to be clean and not excessively worn. That one has got 238,000 miles on it. I think I've shown that picture before. That was from an Explorer, and it was a 2008 Explorer that had a huge, massive amount of miles on it. And I'm going to go through with my Explorer's only got like 80,000 miles on it, and it's got plugs like that in there. And I'm going to go through a little film of changing those out one of these days. And looking, also I'm going to do scope patterns on the plug so you can see before and after and all that, but that's coming sooner than later, hopefully. Now, when it's running right, it should be running at about 200 degrees engine temperature. A cold running engine is not efficient. Some people are troubled when they see the temperature gauge go to the middle or a little higher, but some vehicles, and particularly some of your smaller four-cylinder ones, run up pretty doggone hot, hotter than you would think they should, but that doesn't hurt anything as long as it doesn't go over about 240 degrees. If it's between, And I mentioned before that the fan comes on at 228 on some of these, GM four-cylinder cars like the Cavalier and all. So that tells you right there what's permissible as far as engine temperature. The oil is clean and not contaminated. Fuel quality is good, and the fuel system is delivered as it should, and there's good, clean airflow. Now, if you have an air filter housing on a vehicle that's busted so that it's sucking dirt in there, that's bypassing the air filter and getting in there where the doggone, where it's getting in there where the, sorry, I got distracted there for a second, where it's getting in the, if you pull the air inlet tube out and there's dust all up in there and you've got one that's burning oil, chances are that all of the dust and dirt that has bypassed the air filter because either the air filter wasn't seated properly or that it was a cheap air filter that the seal tore and it let dirt bypass it, or if somebody left the air filter in there long enough so it started coming apart and you could hold it up and see holes through it where where it has just crumbled and it's letting unbridled dirt in there, or if somebody has left the PCV closure hose disconnected and the PCV system, as it's pulling air through the crankcase, if it's pulling dirt through there, it's going to get dirt in the motor oil. And anytime any of that dirt gets in there, it's in a terrible way. Now, this friend of mine that works over here is actually a student that graduated from my program. I was yesterday getting my oil changed, and he was having to replace all the fuel and the entire fuel system on a 6.7 liter diesel because of the fact that it had contaminated fuel that had just screwed the whole fuel system up. He was having to replace the high pressure pump, all the injectors and all that. Contaminated fuel is a real problem on these diesels because a lot of these diesel tanks have got water and algae and all that kind of stuff growing in them. That's another story. I'll talk about that later in another video. All right, so there's the little air filter I put on there, and then you're going to have good fuel pressure, and you got to be running good and warm. Now, basic casual conditions would be, causal, not casual. Why did I say that? Out of time, a tooth or two. There was this friend of mine, and him and his wife bought a 1987 Toyota Camry, brand new, for like $17,000 when it was a new car in '87, and at the time I bought a Tempo that was the same year model as that one. I think I paid $9,600 for that Tempo, and they paid that massive amount of money. That Camry never did run right. Now I'm not, I typically like Toyotas, but that particular one, had the distributor on the end of the head. And if the way that distributor was laid in there, the coil tower was on the bottom of the distributor, and there was always moisture getting in there, and it was causing it to run really bad when the weather was wet. And that car wound up when it had had like 96,000 miles on it. They told me it wasn't running right, and so I said, well, I can take it over to the dealership and I can get a ticket written up on it, and I'll see what it is. And so when I went over, I found out that the timing belt had jumped 3 teeth. It had basically stripped 3 teeth off of there. I drove that thing all the way over there with it running not all that great, and it could have stripped that timing belt and put me down beside the road. Fortunately, those old engines weren't too terribly bad. The earlier Toyota 4-cylinders with the timing belts on them, they didn't bend valves. So one way or another, I had to straighten that out. This particular one was on a 2004 Dodge Stratus 2.4. The timing belt should have been replaced at 102,000, and this happened at 108. See, it wiped out those teeth right there, and that one was dead in the water. Late valve timing causes low engine vacuum, surging, poor fuel economy. So if it's only a little bit late, you're going to have black smoke if it's got a map sensor, but there's all kinds of other issues that you're going to have because of low engine vacuum, because of late timing. All right, so checking the cam and crank timing is really handy. If you line up the cam mark, the crank mark should be in time every time. So when I was checking to see if there was one in time, what I would do is I would line up the camshaft marks and make sure that if it had 2 camshafts or whatever, I'd line those marks up before I even looked at the crankshaft. I wouldn't pay any attention to the crankshaft before I lined up the camshaft marks. And if they were lined up, that's when I would focus on the crankshaft, because every single time the cam marks are lined up, the crankshaft should be. Now, here's something you need to remember. On these cams with these colored links and all that, or if you've got, anytime you've got marks on the chain and on the belt and all, you're going to wind up with a situation where the marks don't line up every time they come around. Basically, the mark will walk all the way around and it'll eventually get to where it lines up again. And so it's a little trickier to do that, you know, but if you've got marks on the gears that line up with a place on the head, you can do it this way. But if you're looking at colored links or marks on the belt that are lined up with marks on the gears and all that, it's a little trickier. But you line those cam timing marks up, that crank mark ought to be lined up. And if it's not, then you got issues with that. All right, so and there's the, you know, like if you line that up, like you've got a little mark over here, if you line it up with this, and you go down there, this ought to be lined up when that's lined up. Now, if you're lining up this one and looking at that one, you might line this one up and that one be over here. So you always do this one first, because this is going to turn twice as fast as that. See, this is actually only turning half the speed of this. You notice the size of the gear? All right, blow-by is handled by the PCV system, but over a lot of miles, the engine oil can be contaminated with fuel because of blow-by. And so if the engine oil is contaminated with fuel, it steams out of the oil and it can be drawn into the PCV system and it creates a rich condition. That condition is exacerbated by frequent short trips. And before I get to the Chrysler story, I used to, whenever I was at the Ford place and we first started working on the vehicles that had, you know, feedback fuel systems and all, if we had one that had rich codes, one of the things that Ford always told us to do was to isolate the PCV valve. In other words, pull the PCV valve out of the valve cover, put a piece of tape or a piece of cardboard over it so that it wouldn't pull in air. And if that air-fuel mixture normalized, then that would mean that it was getting fuel vapors out of the crankcase and you needed to change the oil. That's basically what that meant. So there were times whenever I would smell fuel in the gas, I'd change the oil and I would fix whatever the check engine light was just by doing an oil change. That's also something, you know, on power stroke diesels with the old 7.3s, you know, if the friction modifier was breaking down and all that, and the engine wasn't running right, you could actually change the oil and fix those. So occasionally you'll find an oil change that fixes one. Well, I don't even remember if I told this story before, I may have or not, but I'm going to get a little short version of it. My mother had this Chrysler right here. All right, so it was a 91 model, Chrysler New Yorker, and a little V6 in it. And my dad says, you know, he was a mechanic for years and years and years, but he kind of got out of it about the time that you were doing scan tool stuff and flashing codes and all that kind of thing. And so he called me and he says, this power loss light came on your mama's car. And I said, well, you need to switch the key off and on 3 times and it'll flash out, you know, codes, and then you count that number and tell me what it is. He said, I'm not fooling with no turning no key off and on and looking at no blinking light. It's stupid. Okay, so I went over there and I turned it off and on 3 times. I got a code 17 if I remember right. And then I says, well, that means that it's running too cold and you need to put a thermostat in it. Well, when it runs too cold, it runs richer, right? Let's put that aside for now. So he said, well, I can put a thermostat in. So he changed out the thermostat and he burped it all out and he got that just fine and all that kind of stuff. Everything was peachy. Well, about a week later, he decided to take it over there to his shop, which was mostly closed. You know, he just had the shop with the jack and the jack stands and all that. And he says he changed the oil. And he called me up all frustrated. He said, all I did was change the oil and now this car won't idle. And he says, I cannot understand how changing the oil would keep the car from idling. Well, what had happened was, I thought about this while I was talking to him, and I said it ran with an stuck open thermostat for a long time. It was running rich all the time. It had enough blow-by to where it contaminated the fuel with oil, and it got used to that, and its fuel trim numbers changed to the point to where it's kind of like it adjusted its own carburetor. It was fuel injection, obviously, but it made its own fuel adjustments. When that fuel was gone and it didn't have the fuel coming out of the crankcase anymore because he changed the oil, suddenly it was like having a carb out of adjustment. It went idle. He didn't have a battery cable off or nothing. But I told him, I said, take the battery cable off, let's clean the throttle body out and all that kind of thing, put it back on, crank it up. You know, just for the sake of argument, I had him clean the throttle body out. And I said, crank it up and see what that does. Well, that's all he had to do was pull the battery cable off, clean the throttle body, and it ran like a brand new car. And but anyway, it all went back to that. It was a basically thinking your way all the way back to the thermostat thing, because I said there's only one reason why it wouldn't idle after changing oils, because if it had fuel contamination in the crankcase oil. If somebody drives a vehicle a long time without changing the oil, the fuel is going to contaminate the oil anyway. You know, so that's just part of the deal. Even if it's not running cold, you're going to find fuel contamination in the oil if they've gone too far without an oil change on some vehicles, because some of that blow-by is going to come by there. Well, you know, your PCV valve is basically, you remember on the old round air cleaners, you had a little cotton filter right here. Whenever the PCV valve, there was vacuum being drawn through here, in other words, all the way through here, circling around, and it was basically pulling the vapors, you know, the crankcase vapors that were blow by from the piston rings, so that it wouldn't, if this is clogged up, I told you the other day, it blows the seals, and then it winds up leaking oil everywhere. So if you got an engine that has blown all the dadgum seals, you best be looking at the PCV system, because you're subject to have trouble with that. Now, here's another thing. On some vehicles, somebody may have put the wrong PCV valve on it, and it may be pulling too much air through the PCV system, and that will throw the fuel trims out. So one of the things I used to check, if somebody had just changed the PCV valve, and then they actually were having some sort of a code that indicated that the fuel system was out of balance or the fuel trims were all screwed up, the first thing I would do is go get the proper PCV valve, make sure it was the right one for that particular calibration, put it in there, and sometimes I would fix the fuel trim problem by just replacing the PCV valve with the right one. Ford used to have some plastic PCV valves that would come apart so that they would be pulling way too much air through there, and that would cause trouble too. Now, some of the Chevy pickup trucks have got a PCV valve that looks like an old-fashioned PCV valve, but it's got no parts on the inside of it. It's just got a little small hole drilled in the bottom of it, and that's a calibrated air feed. And they've also, in some of the valve covers on some of these mid-2000s or maybe early like 2012 or something like that, they actually have a valve cover that you have to replace because the PCV part of it is clogged up. And if you pull the line, this line to go into the valve cover that's, you know, pulling vacuum into that, supposed to pull in, in other words, if it's pulling through that little hole that's drilled in there, and it's supposed to meter airflow through there without a PCV valve, it will actually have oil resting in it. I had a picture of that somewhere. We had to do that, but there's a valve cover that you replace that one with that takes care of that problem. And I'll tell you something else. Some of those early, like 2012, 2013, whatever, if I remember right, those things will actually wind up with oil being trapped up in the head. And whenever somebody parks the truck, before that oil has had a chance of trickling down out from under the valve cover back into the crankcase, it'll be low on engine oil, and they'll add engine oil, and then it'll wind up overfull on engine oil, which creates a problem in and of itself. There was this lady that I thought was pretty streetwise about her car that came out there one day, and she was having some kind of an issue. I don't even remember why she brought the car to me, but it was a 92 Buick, and she said she somehow or another the low oil light had come on or something, I can't remember, and so she started pouring oil in it until she could see it in there. She didn't pull the dipstick, she just kept pouring oil in it. And so we had to drain about 4 or 5 quarts of oil out of that one to get it down where it was supposed to be. And I was totally shocked that she didn't have more sense than that. But anyway, the Bronco that we got here, whenever these Broncos were brand new, one of my compatriots over there, he's actually the guy that I had trained, he was over there struggling to figure out why this Bronco was running so horrible when it was cold, and it was under warranty. It was nearly brand new, didn't have very many miles on it. When you crank it cold, it'd sputter and pop and cut up, and then if it warmed up, it was okay. But it did this very consistently. When it was cold, it sputtered and popped and cut up, and he worked on it, and I kept thinking about it and listening to it, and he came over there and he said, I really don't know what to do with this. And I said, well, go out there and ask them what gas they're using. And I said, I just about guarantee you you're using premium gas, because this thing's set up for 87 octane. If you use 93 octane in one of these when it's set up for, that. And he says, yeah, okay, well, I said, don't say anything about are you using premium gas. Just go ask them what kind of gas they're using. So he came back and he said, they said they're using 93 octane, the best they could get. And I said, okay, you give that vehicle back to them and you tell them to drive that tank of gas out of there and fill it up with 87 octane. And if that problem is still there, bring it back, and then you'll have another look at it. And I guarantee you'll never see them again. And that's all it took to fix that. Now, some people have the idea that premium gas is so much better and gives you so much more power and all that kind of thing. Premium gas actually just burns slower. And there are some engines that are tuned to run on premium gas with the compression and all, and they need to actually have 93 octane gas. But you're not helping yourself if you put 93 octane gas in a vehicle that's tuned to run on 87 octane. And there are technical service bulletins that I could have pulled up, and I didn't do that, but I had read them years ago for Ford and Chrysler that says do not put 93 octane gas in an 87 octane car, because it will actually not burn all the fuel because it burns too slow, and it begins to leave carbon caked on the head and on the top of the piston, and then it gets to where it pings and labor knocks, where the only thing you can do is decarbonize it or always use premium fuel, which that was something that just really surprises a lot of people. And I may get, you know, nasty emails because I just said that in this video, but the simple fact is the manufacturer says that. It said premium fuel burns slower. Ford and Chrysler both talked about in their technical service bulletins, and I think they know what they're talking about. Anyway, you can see, you know, this kind of thing here, when it really gets caked up, when somebody's been burning 93 when it was set up to burn 87, and that's what kind of problem that they were developing with this one here, all that didn't have very many miles on it. All right, so anyway, quarter-inch is not enough. Some of your old automotive textbooks used to say, just see if the spark will jump a quarter of an inch and then you'll know it's okay. Well, that's hogwash on any of these newer vehicles of the E-core ignition coils, not the oil-filled ones, you know. But you need that. When I would stretch that spark, I wanted it to stretch out an inch and be scary as all get out. Be just like lightning or something. Because if I only got it to stretch about that far, but it wouldn't stretch any further, then I would know they needed a coil. Most every time it's going to be the coil. And you might remember I was telling you that you could put a test light on one that has a coil. If you hook a test light on I'm talking about a low impedance test light, you know, like it's got little quarter amp bulbs in it, like a cheap test light's got. Not the LED light, but the other one. Hook it up so that you're going to the tack side of the coil, you'll see it flickering. And it's actually going to rob just enough juice so that if you snap the accelerator and it sputters and pops and cuts up, you're going to need spark plugs typically. That's one of the tests I used to do on ignition systems. All right, you can find a leak in spark plug wire when it's popping out the side by spraying soapy water on the plug wires with the engine running. If you know, you may see a little bit of spark, but if it starts misfiring and you see it go pop, 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 you know, whenever you spray that soapy water on there, then you found that spark plug wire. But if you don't, you may not have that, but if you pull the wires off and you look down in the boot and it's all sooty or rusty in the boot, the wires need to be replacing too. Now, why is it sooty or rusty in the boot? Because whenever you have a naked spark, in other words, whenever that spark plug, the core of that spark plug wire needs to be bent around and pinched against that terminal so that there's no naked spark jumping, because naked spark creates radio frequency interference. Secondly, in that boot, every time that naked spark pops, it's going to make ozone, which is O3, and that is a very corrosive gas, and what it does is it creates a rusty looking, sooty looking rusty mass inside that plug wire. You also, well, if you unplug the wire from your coil and you see that it's all chalky and all that kind of stuff, that's going to be because of that ozone that's being made because there's a naked spark in there because the wire's, you know, partially burned up or something like that. Anyway, so that's really important. Always have a look at the spark plugs. If it's a misfire, have a look at the one that's misfiring, but find out which cylinder is misfiring first. Now, the reason I took the picture of these spark plugs is, you might notice that this spark plug and that one have got a very similar wear pattern, and this spark plug and that one have a similar wear pattern. See how the center electrode is worn off on that one, but this one is still. Now, these right here are both being fired by the same coil. These right here are both being fired by the same coil, and you might notice that this is an extreme case of it, but whenever they're both being fired by the same coil, like if it's coil pack ignition, and I'm not talking about your coil on plugs, on one of these spark plugs, the spark jumps this way, and on the other one, it jumps that way, and so it's going to wear these electrodes in a different pattern on the ones. And I was telling my shop foreman that because I kept seeing that on Crown Victorias that had coil pack ignition. You would see the interesting thing about the Crown Victorias, you know, like the old 4.6, was they typically had it so that all of the spark plugs on one bank were fired in one direction and the ones on the other bank were fired in the other direction. And so you would see a different wear pattern on the spark plugs on each bank. All right. According to Ford Motor Company training, spark plug center electrode resistance is supposed to be no more than 8,000 ohms. Now, when you measure that, you need to put that spark plug in a vise and you need to scratch really good on the head of the spark plug where the wire connects, and on the center electrode you got to scratch past whatever carbon is there so you're touching the metal, and you measure that. It shouldn't be over 8,000 ohms. Compare all the spark plugs to each other. You're probably going to see between 3,000 and 6,000 on most of the ones I've checked, unless it's a Champion spark plug, and then it may be between 2 and 17 on a brand new set. Champion does not like you measuring the center electrode resistance of their spark plugs, in spite of the fact that Ford says you're supposed to do that in their training. When the electrodes get worn, rounded, and resistance increases, the spark on coil pack, the first time I saw this was on a 91 Explorer that had coil pack ignition. They can find an alternate path down the outside and start carbon tracking the inside of the wire as well as the outside of the plug. On the Explorer I worked on, I said, well, it looks like a cracked spark plug here, because it was skipping, and so I just put a spark plug in there, put that same boot back on there, and it came back with the same kind of marks on that plug, and that really mystified me. And then I looked inside the boot with my bright flashlight, and I saw those same carbon track marks on the inside of the boot. You can't clean those out, so you may as well just go ahead and replace the spark plug and replace the wires if you see these carbon tracks running down the outside of the plug like that. But the path of least resistance becomes the outside of the plug. See, this is kind of supposed to prevent that, these kind of raised, ridges and all. But on some of your GMs, which I always thought was pretty stupid, they didn't have these ridges like this. They just had those smooth plugs, and you would have to just about destroy the spark plug wires to get them off of there because they were stuck to the plug so hard. That's another reason dielectric grease is a good idea. Not only does it help prevent RFI because it stops up all the places where there may be little renegade sparks, but it also keeps the spark plug wire from welding itself to, in other words, the boot from welding itself to the outside of the wire. So, if I'm working on one of those that has those smooth, where this part of the spark plug is real smooth here where the wire snaps on it on the GM, I typically would sell them a set of wires up front just because I knew I was going to have to destroy some of them to get them off of there. Octane booster can create red dusty deposits like that almost look like rust, and it can cause erratic spark and surging. I mentioned how my brother's 71 Thunderbird started cutting out, and I knew he was putting octane booster in it because it was them high compression 428s on them 71 Bird. And so that's when I first saw that, and when we replaced that, I told him to stop using the octane booster. Some of the old race car nuts would put mothballs in their gas tank to raise the octane. Anyway, long and short of it is, this one here was on a Mustang, and it was jumping to the side, and you can see the carbon tracks where it was jumping to the side because there was some resistance in that red dust and everything. Anyway, if you make sure the plugs are all the way in on those deep wells, you can actually put some Prussian blue. That says Russian, but it's actually P-R-U-S-S, Prussian blue. You can buy that. Permatex makes it. They sell it at the parts house. Put it on there. When you tighten that plug down and you screw it back out, you need to make sure that it has seated, because if it hasn't, you're going to have trouble. That bevel is supposed to enable the spark plug to give up its heat to the cylinder head. The ones with having washers, those washers are there for the same reason. But now, fuel pressure is important. If the fuel pump kicks on and runs when you turn on the key, the PCM's awake and working. I've mentioned that before. Fuel pressure should hold steady and not drop off when the fuel pump's run is done. So if the fuel pressure comes up and then you see it falling off, that's going to cause hard starting when it's hot. And it also shouldn't drop when you accelerate. Now, I had mentioned, and I've got videos on here like this on weak fuel pumps. You know how when you pull the vacuum line off the fuel pressure regulator, it jumps up 10 pounds, and I would pull the vacuum line off the fuel pressure regulator, watch the fuel pressure, snap accelerate it sitting there without it even being loaded. If I see that fuel pressure drop, I know I've got a weak pump, but I'm also going to put a filter on there. As a matter of fact, I may change the filter first to see if that fixes it, but it usually doesn't. And then I go back and I replace the pump, and that takes care of that. Now, the pump is going to be the problem if the pressure leaks off, because you'll have most likely it can be the fuel pressure regulator or an injector, but typically you'll have other drivability problems if it's leaking through an injector, getting in there on top of the cylinder, wetting spark plugs or something, because it'll have a skip when you first start it. But typically the most common reason for it to lose fuel pressure is the little check valve in the pump that's supposed to hold that pressure in the rail. Now, the reason it starts hard is because whenever there's a lot of engine heat on a hot soak, if you don't have good pressure in here being held, you're basically going to have boiling fuel, and that's going to mean you're going to be pushing air through your injectors, and it's going to make it start hard. My Explorer is exhibiting this right now, and I haven't even measured the fuel pressure, but I know that's what's going on because I can switch. I can try to crank it after I've parked it and let it sit for a little while, and it'll spin longer than it should. If I switch the key on about 4 times to pressure up the fuel rail, then it fires right up. That's one way you can tell that you're losing fuel pressure. Everything else about that Explorer runs just like it's supposed to, though. Now, with the engine idling, fuel pressure, vacuum hose disconnected, like I said, you snap the throttle and see if the pressure falls, then check the filter and the pump. These are really a handy little thing. The only problem I got with that fuel pressure gauge there is that the battery seems to go away too fast on it, you know. But basically, you can see how we're measuring that, and I've actually got the fuel pressure on the that one's got a fuel pressure sensor on the fuel rail, and I think that was on a Crown Victoria if I'm not mistaken. But see how that pressure dropped away like it did whenever I got on it. All right, or you can get a gauge with a long hose if you don't have one of these, and you can tape the gauge to the windshield and accelerate a few times to see if the pressure holds. Now this is the one I was talking about where you pull that, all right, you see, and then when I snap accelerate, if I see that pressure drop, then you're going to know that that fuel pressure is weak. All right, we got that pulled off. All right, now we're going to snap accelerate it like we do. So let's just snap accelerate. We're going to do that. Boom. See what it did when we snap accelerated? I don't know how many motorhomes I saw that came in that had that problem. You know, take time to troubleshoot. Now, understand the big picture. Something has to tell the PCM when the engine is spinning and how fast it's spinning. That's the crank position sensor. That determines the cadence at which the injectors fires. Click, 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 click. It doesn't determine how long they stay open when they are firing, but it determines the speed at which they click. All right? That information is used for ignition and fuel injection purposes. Older system used the distributor pickup for that. But that's the crank sensor. Every 10 degrees it's going to have a tooth, and it's going to have one that's missing so that it actually can tell that a cylinder is coming up before top dead center, so on and so forth. All right, and that's your distributor pickup. That one there is an optical one. You know, you've seen those before too, but this particular one has got a little hole every degree. There's 360 holes around there, which is pretty incredible. The crank sensor alone cannot tell a Cepheid engine sequential electronic fuel injection which cylinder is on top dead center. The cam sensor operating in conjunction with a crankshaft sensor and its missing tooth does that. Okay, so older system use a distributor pickup for that too. Okay, the cam sensor will prevent some vehicles from starting. Other vehicles will start but will simply toss a P0340 code or a similar code. Some will start only sometimes or may start hard. Like for example, some of your 4-cylinder Nissan Altimas, if you got cam sensor issues, if you unplug the cam sensor, it may start and it may not. It's really funny how that works. You know, you'd think you could just unplug the cam sensor and it would be aight, you know. But if you unplug the cam sensor and it fires right up when it wasn't starting before, you got problems. I want to tell you something really strange. Well, I was working on an Altima one time, and on that Altima that I was working on, I basically had I scoped it, and it looked for all the world like the cam and the crank were out of time based on the patterns I had. And I checked that. It was on one with a chain, and I looked, and I know they were lined up perfectly. But I just out on a lark, I replaced the cam sensor, and it actually fixed that pattern so that it looked like the cam and the crank were in time, and it started and ran better every time. Now, until I did that, it was one of those might start and might not things. You know, and if you, that was totally incredible. I wasn't even aware that one of those Hall effect cam sensors could be skewed so that it made it look like it was out of time. But that was just very strange. Asian V6 engine, and I've seen this before, with 2 cam sensors may start hard if they've just got one bad cam sensor. You know, you can basically find out like if there's a cam sensor on each head. If one of the cam sensors is bad, like on one of the Nissan V6s, for example, it may start really hard. And we actually had to replace the starter in one for that reason. All right. All right, at key on, your baro and airflow are going in, your closed throttle position voltage. In other words, it's going to want to know what idle is, and so it's measuring that. Engine coolant temperature and intake air temperature are all factored in so that it can make its calculations for the ignition system, the fuel injection, and the fuel pump. All right. When it's idling, it's basically getting information from all these too, which modifies. See, the clicking comes from the crank sensor, and the modification of the injector pulse width comes from temperature and load primarily. All right. Then the output going to be your valve timing, your O2 or your air fuel is coming in. That's basically going to be a mild modification of your pulse width. Your evaporative control and monitor. You know, you got foreground managers and background managers in your software. Catalyst monitoring, throttle control, EGR, fans, AC compressor, misfire monitoring comes in. And then your fuel pump, your fuel injector and ignition system, those are all outputs. Transmission shifts, pressure control, VSS, trans temp. There's all of this information that's got to be sorted out by the brain in this box. You know, that's when you're driving, you've got all this stuff going on. It's going to decide when to do its shifts and all that. You might remember the one I was talking about the other day that was acting really crazy whenever we were slowing down, and it was on a Jeep. I don't remember exactly what the symptom was. It seemed like it was staying in a higher gear or something. But we got back to the shop and found out that that the throttle position sensor would sometimes internally, the voltage would hang up so that it was at part throttle, and it wasn't aware that you had let off the gas. It thought you still had your foot on the gas, and so it wasn't shifting the transmission down to the lowest gear, which was kind of wacky. Now, when you see a check engine light or a service engine soon light, this is always emissions related, and a code will be stored. It doesn't mean the oil needs to be changed or the coolant is low, but if the oil is contaminated with fuel, it can cause a check engine light. If the thermostat is opening too soon or is stuck open, it can cause this too. So keep that in mind. All right. Understand the code system. A 2011 Ranger has 600 possible diagnostic trouble codes that can be stored. Now that's 2011. Think about now. By the PCM alone. This is not counting the codes that can be stored by the other module. There's a heck of a lot of codes out there, a lot of algorithms, a lot of software that was written to make these things work right. All right. Now you can look at the way your codes are laid out on your vehicle system. You know, your vehicle system is going to be like right here, right? Your code type is going to be generic, typically. Now this is a basic primer on this. You know, B, C, P, U, you know, this is going to powertrain, and this is chassis, and then U is network, and B is body, right? All right, so this right here is map sensor voltage is too high, and that's related to the air fuel. See how that goes? All right, that's pretty simple. Look at this one here. 4, auxiliary emission controls. All right, that's a 4 code, you know, that's when it's coming from there. All right, the 01 is insufficient EGR flow. So this one right here is a generic code like you're going to see on your OBD2. Always remember that there are 2 rooms in that engine controller. There is an OBD2 generic room and there's an enhanced room, and they will sometimes have different codes, and occasionally, it doesn't happen hardly ever, but I've run into it a couple of times, you'll clear the code out of the enhanced room and it'll still be in the generic room. I've seen that before too, and that's really confusing because you'll still have a check engine light even though you called yourself clearing the codes. Now the generic codes come out on a different wire than the enhanced codes too, so you need to be aware of that as well. In other words, they come out of the system on a different wire. All right, here's one right here, fuel injector. See that? 03. See how those codes are laid out? All right, so once again, that's generic. Okay, so let's go ahead. Look at this one here. This one right here is basically an OEM style code. Your scan tool, if it's a cheap one, may actually not define that code. It might just say manufacturer specific. But it's a powertrain code. And look, 7 is transmission or transaxle. See that? And then 19, well, look at there, I screwed that up. Park neutral position out. I probably should have put a 19 there. But anyhow, the point is, you got to get familiar with this system. If you don't understand the codes and what sets them, you can't fix much of anything. So find out what can cause the DTC to set first. Like, for example, this is a real simple one. PO125, insufficient coolant temperature for closed loop fuel control. This describes it. This is your possible causes. These are your diagnostic aids, right? All right, and like for example, on the old Ford thing, it says if it's this, go to this pinpoint test because it's slightly different for a Fiesta and a Ranger than it is on all the other ones. You got two different pinpoint tests. You got to get familiar with that. That's the end of the slideshow for today. I hope everybody leaves this presentation knowing something you didn't know when you came in. And that's what we're here for. But I appreciate you guys coming by, and we thank you for watching and tuning in. And make me a comment, hit me a like. See you later.